I just got a new mic, so full disclosure, I'm learning my way around it. So, anyway, thank you so much, Richard, for taking the time. I really appreciate it. And I'm so excited to pick your brain. And I think the first thing, and I know I didn't put this in the prep questions, but if you could first start by explaining a little bit about what it is to be a master of wine and how it's different than other credentials in the industry.
Well, it's great being a master of wine. I've got to say, it is the single most important part of my career progression. I passed in 2015. I've never looked back. It is an industry credential that anybody, I think, should consider if they're interested in aiming for the top level of the wine industry. The qualification requires 3 exams, actually. The tasting is the most notorious. 3 papers, which are taken over 3 consecutive days, covering 36 wines in total. And you have to identify the grape variety, region, vintage, price, winemaking, commercial potential, and potentially other questions depending on what the wines are. But there's also a 5-paper theory exam, and then a third part, which is a research paper, which is a dissertation, effectively, a 10,000-word piece of original research. So when you get through all of that, you have, put yourself through one of the most demanding exams that there is in the wine industry. It's different, for example, from the MS, in that the MS is very practical. It's very performance-based. It's all about being able to serve people tableside. And I don't have those skills. I've never been a sommelier in my life, so I can't, serve a wine properly or to a certain standard. I mean, I can open a bottle of wine, just to clarify, but I can't do the whole service thing. So the MW exam is much more theoretical. It's much more analytical. It's probably more academic, I think it's fair to say. And therefore, it has probably wider applications. So Masters of Wine can be anything. We've got winemakers, we've got marketers, we've got retailers, pretty much every part of the industry, there are MWs involved.
And is it fair to say there are only a few hundred of you right now in the world? I mean, how many Masters of Wine are there right now, would you say?
Right now, there's something like 420 or 30. And I think in total, there's been about 500 and something that have passed. And obviously some have, since it started, some have passed away. So it's a small number, but we are very keen as an institute to recruit many, many more. We actually have as many candidates as there are MWs. So we could double our numbers if those people can get through the exam. Now, not all of them can or will, but, we are very keen to increase the membership of the Institute around the world.
That's incredible. I was even nervous taking the WSET level 1. So this sounds like a very rigorous curriculum. I'm not sure I'd be good out for it, but kudos to you. That's incredible. So the first question I have that I love to ask everyone, if you could invite one person, living or dead, to a dinner party, who would you choose?
I would choose Jane Austen, the Regency era author, most famous for Pride and Prejudice and Sense and Sensibility, and an author that I came across first as a teenager in school. This was before there was a sort of Jane Austen revival in the 90s, and it's still going to a certain extent. There's something about her characters which are so recognizable. And she was maybe not necessarily a wine lover, but certainly there's wine referenced in her books. I just think she's such a keen observer of the human condition that a couple of glasses of wine later, I think it would be quite an interesting conversation.
So your career, you're originally from the UK, you've traveled to Australia, you're now based in Singapore. Really, your career has taken you all over the world. So tell me a little bit more about the work that you're doing and ultimately what you're seeing as the global perception of port wine and who's drinking it.
Well, my role now is Head of Wine Asia for 67 Palmel. It's a private members club that has a club here in Singapore. So I'm in the concierge of the Singapore club right now. And we have a club in London, which opened in 2015, a smaller club in Verbier, Switzerland, and then 2 more coming in Beaune, in Burgundy, and Bordeaux City, with a couple more planned. My role is to look after everything wine related in the Singapore club. So that goes from buying, storing, logistics, right through to events and marketing. Prior to that, obviously I studied the MW as we discussed. I was a writer and communicator and educator for, 11, 12 years in the UK, writing mostly for JancesRobinson.com. I still write for her website. Prior to that, I started off in retail. So I have seen different aspects of the wine industry. You mentioned Australia. I did a vintage there, and I also worked at a retail shop in Sydney for a short time. And what is my global perception of port? Well, I mean, I think, unfortunately, that as a category, it's frequently overlooked. The history of port in the UK, at least, is that while it was very popular a generation ago, if not more, these days it's seen as a seasonal drink at best most of the time. Port prices are undervalued. It's very difficult for port producers to, maintain investment when supermarkets can sell port at unfortunately low prices. So I think in its traditional markets, it has been looking at alternatives to try and reinvigorate the sector to add value back. And some of them have worked, and it's interesting to see those changes. Globally speaking, I mean, from a Singapore perspective, we're not very representative here at 67 because we're talking to a very wine-engaged audience. But I'm pleased to say that we sell a lot of sweet and fortified wine, and port is obviously a cornerstone of that category. We love having large format ports, and we are able to sell dozens by the glass. That's one of our propositions. So people often will have a small glass of something with their meal, and we try and encourage that as best we can.
And I remember in our initial conversation, you had mentioned that the Singapore market is almost like a microcosm of the wine industry in the UK. And I'm so curious, how do you figure? How does that work?
Well, I mean, the reason is, historically, is that Singapore was for a long time ruled by the British, and a lot of the rule of law and the trading structure and everything else is based on UK legislation. So that kind of just stands to reason. I think people are surprised for such a small city. I mean, second smallest country in the world, right? Population around 6 million. That we have so many different producers, for example, importers, something like 300, which is huge for such a tiny place. But it's representative of the fragmentation of the industry at large. So there are, countless wine producers out there, and they all need something different in terms of representation. And there are so many wine enthusiasts who are prepared to, put together a little company and spend their weekends going around and tasting with people and selling them little parcels of wine here and there. And that's what makes it so interesting. The other part of it, if I may say, is that the trends here are largely reflective of what's popular in not just London, but New York, Hong Kong, pretty much anywhere with a sophisticated wine market. Wine lovers are interested in drinking the same things around the world.
Also in our initial conversation, and I love that you had mentioned this, that port is the underdog of the wine industry, which I wholeheartedly agree with you on that. But where do you see the most potential for port wine, especially as it becomes more mainstream? And where do you see, innovations? Some of the older port houses, as we've talked about, are experimenting with, ready to drinks and different iterations. But where do you see the most potential for port to go mainstream, and especially among American consumers?
Well, I think
it's a loaded question.
The straight answer to that is nobody knows.
Yeah.
And if they did, they'd be doing it already. And perhaps exactly what you're doing is kind of what their innovation should be, which
Mhm.
is, to make it more relevant, more sort of more customized to a particular audience, the American audience, because it has pretty much stayed as a very traditional product. Now, that's its strength, of course, because there's nothing else quite like it in the world. It has amazing heritage. So it would be a shame to ignore that. But if you look at what has happened recently in the last, since I've been in the industry 20 years or so, there was a brief moment when rosé port became a thing. And while that still exists, it is cheap and nobody is really investing in trying to make that a quality product. So I don't think that is the future of port. Much more successful has been the rebranding and investment in tawny styles. Now that really is something that I think has got good potential, and there's a couple of reasons why. One is you can drink it chilled, and I don't think you should underestimate how important that is for such a simple sounding difference. But drinking tawny port straight out of the fridge is just a completely different experience to the old bottle of vintage port that needs to be decanted and served at room temperature and so on.
What are you seeing? I mean, younger folks, or how are you encouraging them to drink more wine?
Well, I mean, we have so literally, to answer that question, we have a discounted category for under 35s and under 30s in our club. So we try and encourage younger wine fans to join and get on the journey with us. But as you said, it's very hard. Wine is, I think, by its nature, something that takes a while to get into. It's unusual to have people in their 20s or even in their 30s who are highly engaged with wine, unless they're actually employed in the wine industry.
Sure.
And tequila, craft beer, all those other categories we've mentioned, they're more accessible, they're more fun, they have more marketing money apart from anything else. I mean, wine has always struggled because it doesn't have huge budgets for that sort of thing. And that's fine. I think the conversation about how younger people are drinking less wine is completely paranoid and actually not, well, it probably is literally true, but certainly not something to be worried about. One of my favorite answers to this is that people are older for longer than they're younger. And
it's true.
I know that sounds flippant, and I don't want to just sort of dismiss younger drinkers at all.
Sure.
I would love a way of reaching those people and encouraging them to drink wine, but I don't necessarily think that it's important. I think, people as they get older will develop an interest in wine. Not everyone, but it's much more likely to happen with time than it is with some super trendy, celebrity endorsed brand or anything like that. That is the domain of spirits and maybe champagne, for example. Champagne can do it. But regular wine can't really do that, and I'm not sure that it needs to.
So innovations aside, though, you also had said that port should focus on what port does, and that's its heritage. And I am fascinated, and I've really fallen in love with just the pageantry of port wine and his history and the traditions of it. So as a master of wine, what makes port wine so special? What's the selling point? What would you tell someone who's never tried port before?
Well, that's a really interesting question, because you could answer that by saying that there's not very much special about port in the way that it's made. Anybody could do it anywhere. Oh, yeah. I mean, there are other fortified wines made in the same way in different parts of the world. If you have the time and resources, you can go and buy grapes and fortify them with brandy and age them in oak and create a port style wine. That's
right,
not
port style, so though, right? It's not the authentic. Yeah, right.
And so that's the operative word, authentic.
Yes.
So what actually, so the answer which would make a difference is emphasizing the heritage and the authenticity of port as a product, not in the way that it's made, not necessarily even in the taste profile, actually, but it's about connecting it with people and places. You know, if anybody has been to Villanova de Gaia and the Douro River and heading up into the vineyards, it's a stunning place. A lot of wine and growing areas are, but there's something particularly dramatic about port country. It's extremely historic. It has links to British traders, especially, that go back centuries. Mm-hmm. The origin of the product itself was to service the UK market by creating something that was fortified so that it could withstand a journey back from Portugal to the UK.
Well, you guys were at war with France, so you couldn't drink their wine. So you were banning the French wine. You were like, we're going to our friends in Portugal. That was the Treaty of Windsor, I think.
And yes. And those are the stories that people will connect with. The fact that so many of the port company names are British names, they have a kind of trading heritage. You think of Taylor's, Dow's, Graham's. That kind of connection to British culture is a really integral part of what makes port the attractive wine that it is, I think. Now, it happens to also be extremely delicious. And I think that there isn't anything quite like it, despite my answer at the beginning. You know, you potentially go out there and make it from anything. I suppose I made that point because I wanted to explain that, you know, often people in the wine world get obsessed by, you know, scores and points and taste and blind tasting. And that is maximum 50% of the enjoyment of port, if not less. For me, the enjoyment of port and other wines is understanding that connection to a place and the people that make it.
But can you really make port? And I mean, obviously there are port wine styles around the world, but you would be able to tell, wouldn't you? I mean, certainly you, if that you were tasting a port wine style versus one from the Douro, correct or no?
I think right now, if you took the best port style wines from around the world and put them against a selection of the best ports, then yes, you'd be able to tell. And that's because port has the investment, heritage, and incentive to make the very best examples of its kind, whereas other wine regions, you know, there's quite a few in Australia, for example. Now, they're great examples, but they are rarely focused on in the way that people focus on making port in Portugal. So that means that the port wines have got a distinctive difference. If the underlying question is, would it be possible to make something of equivalent quality somewhere else in the world? I think the answer is probably yes, really? To be honest. Yeah, and I think that there's a lot of... Now, let me just qualify that by saying I don't necessarily think that that's a good thing, or indeed that it can be proven one way or another. Certainly a lot of people would disagree with me. This idea of terroir is sacrosanct in wine, that you can only get something of a certain style from a certain place. It's true to an extent, but, you know, I've tasted enough wine from around the world and got wines wrong often enough that I know that it's so easy to confuse different wines and different styles. And it's because the sophistication of winemaking and also the exploring of new terroirs means that there's loads of potential that is as yet unexplored. So I think as a theoretical answer, it would be crazy to say that port can only possibly come from one place. You know, legally, okay, yes, can only be called port if it comes from there. That's a good thing. That's a good thing. But the idea that you couldn't possibly make it from anywhere else, nobody can say that with certainty.
That's interesting. I'm fascinated by this only because there's so many wine loyalists, right, who are like, champagne is in Champagne. Like, why you can't recreate that experience. And it does have to do with the terroir. And the Douro Valley is so extreme, right? It's this rugged, mountainous, I would argue, one of the most extreme winemaking regions in the world, especially as it relates to climate, right? Porto's a little rainier, and then you get into the valley and it's hot, and there's microclimates and there's different, sections of it. But to recreate that experience, I feel like the wine would just taste differently. But that's very intriguing. So, I mean, I wouldn't know. You would have to if you put an American style port wine with next to it, would probably take me a minute. But yeah, I think the purists would probably be very horrified by that.
Yes, I love horrifying purists. That's one of my hobbies.
And port is kind of I would say it's like a sleeper hit cult. There are folks who are, and I've talked to them and I am bringing them onto the podcast, but they are I talked to someone who's sampled 15,000 bottles of port wine in his career. And it's there are purists out there who will tell you it can only come from the Douro and everything else pales in comparison. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned Champagne, for example. That's a good comparison to make as well, because Champagne is a region and a sort of technique, and there are undoubtedly outstanding champagnes, and I would never dispute the quality that they are capable of. The idea that you can't create wine that is as good, if not better, from other regions has been disproven. There's no doubt about it. I mean, obviously, I'm got an vested interest in English sparkling, because I worked at an English wine producer for a year in the vineyards, and I happen to think they're really, really good. But you could say the same for great sparkling wine from Tasmania. There's plenty in California. They're made all around the world. And I've had great sparkling wine that was 10 years lees aged from Brazil that would comfortably compete with top-end champagne. So that is a great example of where people are making sparkling wine outside these regions. Now, I have no problem with somebody defending that champagne will always be the best. I wouldn't necessarily disagree with them, but I think that's what makes wine interesting. It's part of the conversation. With fortified wine, there isn't the money in it for people to go out and do these examples of potentially great quality red, sweet, fortified wines elsewhere in the world. If there was the money and if there was the sort of drive to do it, it would be interesting to see what we'd come up with.
After this conversation, I might put some vines out back outside Boston and see what happens. I don't think the people in Portugal would approve, but I mean, I could call it port. Exactly. Are there any wines that you're just absolutely maybe one wine in particular that you're absolutely obsessed with, that you're this cannot be recreated anywhere else?
Well, I mean, I think my quick answer is no, because I've been fortunate enough to taste wine from all around the world. And, in most cases, there's something similar somewhere else. The one example which springs to mind, actually, which is probably not where most people might go at, is Hunter Valley Semillon from Australia, right? Is an example that I have not seen reproduced anywhere else, because it's low in alcohol, 10, 11%. It is utterly unoaked, but tastes like it has very oaky spice character with bottle age, matures for decades, totally against all expectations, but is incredibly neutral when it's young. I have never had anything else like that. Do I think that, however, that you could make it if you planted Semillon somewhere and picked it early and, I don't know, made it in similar climatic conditions? Well, yeah, I do think that, because, that's the kind of science in a way. The romance of it is that it's connected to a particular place. And let's take Burgundy, because that's a really easy example. White Burgundy. Do I think that you can really recreate the sort of amazing experience you get from drinking a Montrachet? even if it's the very, very best Chardonnay from California or Australia, New Zealand, well, yes, you can recreate the flavors of it and the quality of it. That's been proven in so many blind tastings where people happen to prefer the non-Grand Cru Burgundy Chardonnay that's in the lineup. You can do that all day long. That's actually not really the point. The point is when people drink Le Montrachet, when they see that label, they have an emotional connection to it. And that is really what we should be focusing on for wine. It's about that connection to place and people. It's understanding why that wine is what it is, where it comes from, not just assessing it on its organoleptic qualities.
Right. And we all know people buy stories. That is the romance of wine, as you said, is the storytelling behind it, which is why I'm hopeful with port. I think Portugal, as we all know, is the number one tourist destination in the world. It's having like an Iceland moment right now. Everybody's going. And I think that's helping to kind of put it more on the map, and people are learning about the story, the history of it, and experiencing the Douro Valley. And I think that is certainly helping Port's case, if you will. But people buy a story. I work in marketing. I understand that. They want the emotional connection. So it makes all the sense in the world. My last question for you is, do you drink port? And describe to me, I know you mentioned tawnies. Do you have a favorite port? And describe to me the ideal scene. Is it a port and tonic in the summer or a tawny by the fire? What does that look like?
Well, I'm going to stick with my theme for this conversation, which is that the people are the most important part of any experience. I've been fortunate enough to taste amazing drinks all around the world in the company of complete strangers in totally neutral laboratories, and it's meaningless. It doesn't matter how good the wine is. But you can put a very humble wine in the company of loved ones with an amazing view and a nice simple meal, and it will be the best wine experience you can come up with. Now, port has got a very particular application in those contexts. It's not the kind of thing that I think you realistically are going to drink throughout a meal or that you might want earlier in the day. But the most memorable port experiences I've had, especially recently, have been from large format bottles. I think that's a really great way of sharing port. So here at the club 67 Pall Mall in Singapore, we've got these 15-litre bottles of port, specifically of Colliator port. So a tawny port from a single vintage. We've recently been going through a 1997 Colliator from Dirk Newport, great producer, fantastic wine, absolutely beautiful. And we've got this 15-litre bottle on the bar upstairs, and you can buy it. You can even just buy a small 25 ml pour, or you can have a little bit more if you like. And the idea that that has been shared among hundreds of people, and you can go upstairs and have a nice dinner and so on, and just have this small amount of tawny port to finish off your meal, sharing it with, hopefully your loved ones or your friends around the table, but then in a incredible room with loads of other wine lovers, that's a pretty special experience.
I think that was my favorite answer to that question. I have been hosting dinner parties since I was like 15 years old, and I always tell people the best ingredient doesn't matter what you're cooking, it's your guest list. That's why I always ask, like, if you could invite someone living or dead, who would it be? And obviously Jane Austen would be wonderful, but it's important to mind your guest list, because nothing will matter if the conversation and the people aren't there. It's not as meaningful. Yeah. And that's when you get the great stories. And I always say, if you just uncork a bottle of port wine, it just keeps the party going. It's like putting another log on the fire. And I've heard some crazy stories come out of port wine when it's passed around. So in good company, that's the key.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it is that kind of contemplative, and because it's so sweet and warming, it is a friendly wine. It's easy to understand. It is a crowd pleaser. I think it does do exactly that. It encourages people to be more open and talkative and sharing.
But I always tell my friends, who have kind of turned their nose up and ew, I would never, but it's until people are empowered to try something, do they really get to explore and experience it. So I always say, just, have a taste, try it with your chocolate torte, see that taste, and once people start to experience it, it then becomes a different kind of animal. But you definitely, it's one of those things where you just have to kind of serve it to people and see what happens. It's not for everyone, but under the right circumstances, it certainly can be.
Yeah, exactly. And, that's an important part of the conversation too, is that it doesn't have to be for everybody. This is something that when it appeals to its wine, the lovers of those styles, it makes a really strong connection. It doesn't need to be a mass market product. That's what makes it special.
I wish that we were having port. I know it's 9 a.m. your time. It's a little late for me now, but thank you so much, Richard. This has been incredible, and I just so appreciate you taking the time.
It is a pleasure. Like I said, I do want to support anything which promotes a wine that gets overlooked. We talked about port being the underdog. And it's under pressure. It's a region that has recently struggled to sell its products to places. So if we can help change that, then so much the better.
Well, I think there's a lot of challenges between climate change, generational drinking habits, consumer preferences. The fact that I remember when I told my parents, it's like, I'm just going to start a port wine for the American dinner party. And they're like, oh, have fun with that. That's crazy. But you know what? It's the craziest ideas that sometimes get the most notoriety, right? Like, we don't need another celebrity endorsed mezcal. We don't. We have enough. We're good.
Well, I agree with that for sure. Yeah.
So, but I will keep you posted, and I appreciate your support. I always say you can't spell support without port in it. So, thank you very much, though. This has been wonderful, and we'll definitely keep the conversation going. I'll probably have more questions for you. You're the only master of wine on, in my network, so that's very special to me. So that's exciting.
Well, it's a pleasure. If you need, connections to others, whether it's MWs or I've got a few people that I know in the port world that I'd be very glad to introduce you to if you think that's going to be of use. And obviously, if you're anywhere near Singapore at any point, then you would be very, very welcome to come and share some of this 15-litre Colliator 97 if there's any left, which you'd have to be quick.
That sounds amazing. I don't think there are planes fast enough yet, and I also I don't love to fly. My husband always makes fun of me. Like, I'm not great in the air. Like, I belong on the water or land. That's my sweet spot.
Well, if you took a cruise here, it would definitely be gone by the time you got here. But
if I sail,
either way, it's an open invitation.
Thank you. I appreciate it. And yes, definitely continue the conversation with port among friends. I would absolutely love to meet whoever is in your network who would love to chat about port. I'm trying to continue the conversation. And obviously, this has been a global conversation, which I love. So the more folks we can get to talk about port wine, I think that's the best way to uncork a conversation. So
cool. Agreed.
Thank you, Richard. Take care. Have a great day.
No worries. Nice to see you.
Bye-bye. Thanks for listening to Drink Port, a podcast from Starboard. Interested in being featured? Visit starboardwine.com/podcast to learn more. And don't forget to subscribe to the newsletter so you can join the venture to a new port. Cheers and drink port.